So, Autopilot. You probably heard the buzz around Autopilot V2 or device preparation, and maybe you're wondering what's actually new here. Because on paper, it might look like the same thing where you enroll the devices, you get Intune policies pushed down, users sign in, and they're ready for their first day of work. But in reality, there's a lot of key differences between what people now term as V1 versus V2. So what's actually different? In this video, I'm going to walk you guys through how device preparation compares to classic Autopilot side by side with a comparison diagram that I built that highlights the key differences. We're going to break this down by device registration, policy setup, installing apps, end user experience, and reporting. And I'm going to be showing you guys as we're walking through this a live demo, configuring this step by step so that you can see what this looks like in action from the Intune Admin Center into the end user experience. So let's go ahead and dive in. Okay guys, so diving in here, I quickly wanted to reference, I did make a whole video tutorial on configuring Autopilot V1 a few weeks ago, but I did also want to call out and apologize that I did misspeak in the sense of connecting to your OEM provider within the Intune Admin Center. This is actually something that you need to do when you're talking about registering devices so that whenever you procure them from that provider, such as Dell or Ingram, as an example, they could actually automatically upload them into your admin center. This isn't done by an OAuth connection or an app registration today. It's done via them sending you an acceptance link and you consenting to them being a partner within your portal. And then that's when they'll be able to upload those devices. And for many people I've talked to, it's a pretty inconsistent experience unless you're adding a lot of devices. And many of you out there might have seen the same. I just wanted to clear that up though. And again, apologize for some of the misinformation there. I've since edited that out of the video, but wanted to clear that up as we dive in here today. So this is the architecture, just to quickly revisit, of the Autopilot setup as it was previously done in V1, and still a lot of people use this today, obviously, as well too. But the big thing here is that we're pre-configuring all of our apps, our settings, our security tools, our patch cycle that we want to deploy to a device, and we're signing it out to groups or to devices as an example. So whenever that device gets shipped to a user and they boot that up, the Autopilot profile can actually pull down and deploy to that device for this end user. Now, when we talk about some of the constraints or some of the pain points related to that, there's a lot of pain potentially around how you actually register devices into the Autopilot service via the hardware hash, as an example. There's also been a lot of pain around the actual installation of all of your applications going down to the device. So we'll be unpacking that more today. And certainly some pain around, just basic setup failures. And we'll certainly go through some more of the troubleshooting as well. When we start to get into this comparison diagram though that I built here, as I drag that over, I really wanted to highlight a lot of the top level comparisons that you'd want to take into mind as you're thinking about potentially moving from V1, or if this is your first ever exposure to Autopilot and wondering if you go to the classic experience or this newer experience that's actually been out for almost 2 years now, what considerations you might want to take into place. So as we go through these, I'm actually going to share my screen here into the portal. I've summarized this in a nice table, and I'll be referencing a lot of documentation actually from Michael Niehaus. I think this is his last name pronounced. He used to work at Microsoft, has a great blog, comes out with a lot of great Autopilot articles, pull a lot of this information from his information, and then my own testing that I've done here as well too. But when we talk about, one of the basic premises here, we have this consideration about device ownership and device registration. So with Autopilot V1, you have to go in and actually register the device into the portal here. And that was done a lot of different ways. Maybe that was through the OEM provider. That could have been through, using this PowerShell script that I showed in my last video, where you actually can connect during the out-of-box experience and sign in to register the device on the fly. It could also be done by running another PowerShell script to harvest the hardware hash from the device if it's already been out of the out-of-box experience and you're just running it from the desktop, as an example. But the key thing here was that you had to get the device into the service in order for it to be registered, in order for it to be tethered to your tenant, so that it could deploy down, this Autopilot profile. Now, the key difference here with the new experience is that we're simply saying that devices can register dynamically. We don't have to know the device itself necessarily, before a user can actually just boot it up And as soon as they go through this signing experience that I'm seeing or showing here on the screen, that actually will recognize their work or school account as part of that. And then it can actually pull down this profile that we're going to set up in the Intune Admin Center with all of our settings pre-configured by just having it assigned to that user. And that's a key distinction here between the two services here that I like to call out, because on the surface, it does make that a lot more simplistic in the sense of the setup. In previous times, this has kind of been corrected, in more recent times, but it would default to being classified as personal unless you were to add a corporate identifier, within here. So in classic times, if you were able to upload the device hardware hashes, things like that, it would automatically classify in corporate. Now it will do that as well too after these changes that they've made. But you can also, if you want to make sure you're only getting the corporate devices coming through there, not BYOD, as an example, you will need to upload the devices as a corporate device identifier. I'm going to go through that as well too. So it's a key distinction here, but if they're going through the out-of-box experience and using their admin credentials and using that to join the device to Entra, it should show up as a corporate device, but there's a couple of considerations there. So when we talk about that, if we go into the Intune Admin Center, we're going to start to walk through the basic policy creation here, just so you can see the key differences. Now, when we talked about the old Autopilot deployment profile, you would come in here and start building this, as part of this Windows setup. And I'm just going to say this is a Windows test. You could then convert all of your targeted devices that you would assign to this to Autopilot devices. So that way, in the future, if you ever did reset them, as an example, reuse them, they would automatically, join into the Autopilot service. You wouldn't have to necessarily get that hardware hash as part of that. And then here on the next page is where you defined a lot of the out-of-box experience. And so this is where you get into some of the major differences here when we talk about the new profile that we'll get into. The deployment mode could be user-driven or self-deploying. Self-deploying largely was for kiosk devices or multi-use devices. I always like to use the example of maybe a bank that has a kiosk that runs where it's maybe a single application that's running on it. As an example, you could choose whether it's hybrid or Entra joined. As part of that, you had a lot of the configuration settings here for what the user will see in the out-of-box experience. You could define the user account type. And then this is what was classically known as the white glove experience or pre-provisioned deployment, where you could hit the Windows key 5 times and not having a user context and set up all of your apps and settings. Largely, I saw this used a lot, particularly for companies also that leverage a lot of line of business applications you might need to install prior to the user actually using that. And then the other one here was the device name template, simply saying, hey, can we give it a nice name template so that's consistent, especially helpful for larger organizations. But I think all of us like to have at least some level of understanding of a naming convention of our devices within here. Now, the key thing with V1 here is you go through next, and then you would go and you would assign this to a group or all devices. As an example, likely, you already have a group set up for Autopilot devices, and you go through and you would create that as an example. And then in the devices section here, this is where you would either import or go through that out-of-the-box experience where you hit F10 and enroll the devices in here, and then they would get that profile assigned to them, which would then take effect the next time you either rebooted that device or reset that device, and it grabbed that profile if it had a live internet connection, as an example. So I call that all out to say, this V2 experience is where you don't have to do the upload in any capacity, and we'll start to walk through how you configure this policy and understand why that is the case. So one of the first steps you'll do as part of V2 deployment is you're actually going to create a new group dedicated for the V2 experience. And within here, you could call this device prep, and I'm just going to call it Windows 11. As an example, you can call this whatever you like here, but this is going to be specifically a group that's leveraged to house all of our devices that come through this V2 experience. And the basic premise here is that it needs to be a security group, and it needs to have an owner defined, which is actually a service principal. So if you look up Intune here, this is where you'll see this Intune provisioning clients as an example. And I'll link all these instructions in the video description, guys, just so you don't have to completely take screenshots or anything like that. Microsoft does have this documented as part of this, but you want to add that service principal as an owner and click create. Now, the basic premise of this, when we go through the actual setup and configuration of this in the future, is really to start taking a look at how can this go through and actually house all of our policy configurations and the scripts we're going to deploy and the applications we're going to deploy, to kind of preload them as part of that deployment profile. And that actually makes it a faster experience. And I think that's an asterisk to that we'll get into, is whether or not that is faster. But certainly that's what, they cite the documentation and what will happen when they go through this group here as well. And so the other group that they have you create here is a just regular group here where you have members allocated. And this is what you're actually going to use to go ahead and assign the deployment profile, to a group of users. And you can create multiple profiles over time. The next thing that we want to do is we want to take this device prep group here that we created that has that Intune service principal assigned to it, and we're actually going to assign it to any of the scripts or applications that we want to deploy. So I go under the application section here. I've already pre-made, Microsoft 365 apps in Google Chrome. In this situation, you can go under here and you can go under this section under required. I have the device prep group here that I created previously as part of this, assigned to this application. And you can do the same here under the scripts section. And in this particular one, I've gone under the platform scripts under test scripts. And I've actually created under the properties, the device prep group that's assigned to this as well too. Now, after that step is completed, if you go back under the devices here, this is where we start to get into more of the heavy comparisons where I can explain more as we keep going out. If we go under enrollment again, this is the device preparation policy profile that you'll begin to create here. You notice I already have one and you can set a priority for it here, but you have this drop down here with automatic and preview. And this is specifically for Windows 365 devices, and it is in preview at this point in time. But then we have this user-driven, which is the only option today for the V2 experience. So I'm just going to call this test as part of this video. And then this is where you are adding that device group that we created. So this is the device prep Windows 11. Doesn't have any devices into it yet because we haven't had any device go through it and grab that profile. As an example, this is where they're now combining, the policy I was just showing you guys for V1, which is the out-of-box experience profile that you'd create for the Windows Autopilot profile. But they're also combining it here with the, enrollment status page that you would see as well. We'll get into that as well too. But within here, you have these options here, which look very similar. They're in the sense of what option you have by default. But within here, they give you a drop down only to show you one option. So I think their intention is to add to more of this over time, but they've actually been saying that for over a year now. So it's been a long time since we've actually seen any change here. And so you'll notice there's no self-deploying mode. It's a single user option, and the only option you have is Entra join. So no hybrid deployments are supported or hybrid join deployments. You can set either a administrator or a standard user. Again, another weird UI that they put a toggle here as part of this, but this is simply, saying I want to make this a standard user. And then this out-of-box settings is where you really get into what was previously the enrollment status page. If I go to a new tab here, just to show you guys this side by side, if I go under enrollment and I go to the enrollment status page here under Windows Autopilot, you can modify the default properties on this guy as far as the default one. I showed this in the video last, a couple weeks ago now that I showed this. But as you'll notice here, the enrollment status page here within these settings actually has a lot more settings that you can configure comparatively speaking to this, but some of them overlap. So we get this minutes allowed before showing the installation error. And this is where I see a lot of, installations fail for Autopilot. They get hung up. And there's two different reasons for that. One of which that I've heard a lot of, actually got this in the webinar that I was speaking to about this earlier this week, is related to the user's Wi-Fi being so slow that it just times out. So that's definitely a consideration. But I think the other big thing that V2 is trying to solve for here is actually when you dictate the applications you want to be blocking or saying are required to load, before the autopilot or before the user can access the device, they don't actually respect these being installed first. Meaning in V1, if you've got 20 blocking applications or maybe 10 blocking applications, in this case I just have the one, and you also have 20 other applications being deployed in the app section to that device or to that user, it will actually try to go ahead and install all the applications at once, which can really create a big uptick in this minutes allowed before showing the installation error. So what I always recommend for this setting is to make sure that you properly pilot this as you would, with a normal computer that's going to be deployed, all the apps you would, and in this case, the scripts as well too. So this is something that you would want to measure that's accurate and create yourself a little bit of a buffer. As part of this, you've got your same support message here that you would have, that's shown in this particular section. And then you can allow users to skip setup after multiple attempts, show the link diagnostics here. This is helpful, I think, if you're intervening. It'll show them a link on that page, basically to, allow them to download the logs, and that might be something you do because obviously they're not going to sift through that as part of that. But then you get these options here for applications that you can deploy, but now in V2 you can also set PowerShell scripts to install during these process. So that's why we went ahead and assigned them to that device prep group as an example. And this was not an option or is not an option in V1 with the enrollment status page. So you can only do blocking apps as part of this. Other things though, as a comparison, you can't toggle this on or off for Windows updates. This is a newer setting. And typically we would just say, generally speaking, that you would always want to have updates deploy, but you could have an environment where the line of business apps or something isn't compatible with a newer version of Windows where you might be pausing the updates and don't want it to automatically, update to the latest version of Windows in the out-of-box experience. You might want to say that's a no, but you don't get that option in the V1 or V2 experience, I should say. And so you don't have some of these other settings like allow the user to reset the device, but that's a native option actually when they do get that after you actually go through the experience. Allow the users to use the device if an installation occurs, and this is the same type of message here if the desktop deployment fails. It's a little bit reworded, as part of this. If you go cross compare these settings side by side, and again, this is one profile that we are creating for both the ones that we've done before, and this profile progress, as we'll see here, is a little bit different. With these experiences, a little sneak preview here, but this is kind of a side-by-side, of the device preparation here on the right of what the user sees versus here in the existing enrollment status page. This is what you're saying, show app and profile configuration process. If this is set to yes, this is what they're going to see, and it's going to go through and take them through, all the installation versus just, I think, a little bit more user-friendly percentage status complete. As part of this, but there's some caveats to that as far as the full integrated experience of what they get within there. So good that you get scripts that you can deploy as part of this, and also good, I think this is one of the best parts in my opinion, where they actually respect these apps being deployed first and install them first before getting into other apps that actually start installing after you go through the out-of-box experience. So pretty nice there. And if I go in and click on add, they'll see the applications I have, within my environment or any scripts, as part of this as well too. So the scope tabs is something you're probably familiar with. You don't need to do. And then, within here, you can also then assign this to that Autopilot Device Prep group, which has the users that you're assigning the profile to. So this is what's linking the key here, that when that user signs in with their UPN, it'll know and understand that they're being assigned this profile, as part of the UPN that they're logging in with, and then they'll be able to pull that down here as well. So if we revisit this as far as the comparison table, when we are going through this, we talked about the device registration being much more streamlined. But this is what they call enrollment time grouping for dynamic profile targeting. This is where you're adding the device prep group to those applications and scripts, and then it can dynamically install them supposedly does that faster. But, when we talk about the installed apps, I talked about unselected apps will install after provisioning completes, which generally speaking will create a faster provisioning experience. But there's some articles that Michael, I mentioned earlier, has written that kind of debunks this a little bit that I'm not going to go to, but it depends on the app, depends on if it requires a restart as an example. So there's always an asterisk with this, but generally speaking, when I did a side-by-side, if I give you this example of installing the same applications, in this case, just the two in Autopilot V1 and V2 with the profiles and things like that as well, this took around, I would say 30 minutes. This took around 10 to actually complete. So that was just my experience. And again, just doing testing, it's not a production scale. So you could try out both. PowerShell script support. This is supported after, the enrollment with the Intune management extension, but not pre the user leveraging that device as part of device preparation. There's the MSI and Win32 app consideration. I think if you know this pain, you know this pain of installing during this, and you had order and dependency issues which would often cause a lot of errors as part of this that you don't get into now with the device prep. And then, I think they have a specific order that they leverage. I think they try to install MSI apps first and then Win32 apps afterwards, and then others install after the setup is complete. So hopefully less errors when you go through that process. The out-of-box experience pages, you guys may have noticed that, but you don't get to configure as many that you would want to hide potentially. I don't think it's a huge deal, as part of that. I think the most conflicting thing is when they first get to that page to sign in, it'll ask them if they want to sign in with a personal account or a work or school account. And I think naturally they could assume and gravitate if they got a corporate device in the mail that they'd sign in with work, but we all know our end users, right? So that's just something that they would have to see. The enrollment status page is not a thing, right? In the sense of like the profile configuration, they've got that percentage bar that's tracking the items, that we're seeing in here. Device naming isn't supported yet in V2, which is kind of a bummer. If I would say is a big one, that you can go in and rename afterwards, but to have that not automated is not great. The self-deploying mode is not option. The white glove experience is not currently exported, as part of the V2 option that you would be able to do. And then this is a big one, I think, for what I've seen, which is around the reporting. So I think one of the things that you would notice, and we've seen previously, is there's been these open source package libraries in PowerShell that we've traditionally used, or maybe you didn't know about these, but I think it's interesting that this has been installed, 8.6 million times as an example for this script here that can get you device diagnostics around Autopilot that you can run to understand and kind of pull back what's going wrong in the logs specifically without sifting through hundreds of logs as part of this. And there's a newer version that I'll link in the blog post as well too that's been built by the community. It's owned by Andrew Taylor, who's a great resource for the community, also an MVP around this, but this does support V2 deployments as well too. Can still do this. I'll do this maybe in a different video showing you guys how to run this, but got a lot of diagnostic information where we really didn't have a feedback loop before within Intune as an example. So if you go in under devices and monitor within here, you have this Autopilot deployment status, which has been in a preview for a very long time. And I don't think it's ever worked, or I just maybe haven't seen it work ever personally as part of this. It wasn't very helpful as part of that too, which is why you saw so many people go to other methods here. But within here now, they have this device preparation deployments. And this is one of the things that they tout as a huge differentiator too. You have near real-time reporting, which I think it's a little bit delayed, from what I would consider to be real-time that they reference in their documentation, maybe a couple minutes, 5 minutes after, we've seen changes on the front end of that experience. But this will be in, a certain status as far as pending or rolling out. And then the phase here, can tell you how long or what phase it's in, right? Whether that's app installation, script installation, and so forth. And then you can tell you the deployment time. So this says, 6 minutes. I would say I experience more closer to to 10. But when you click in here though, you'll be able to see more of the information around the device itself, but you have more telemetry back here around what installed, what it failed, as an example, what's not installed yet. And this is where I don't have any scripts in this profile, but in the demo video or the webinar I did earlier this week, you're seeing on the screen, I actually showed this in a failed state as an example because the script failed. It showed that in the phase that it failed in the script installation, got a little bit more telemetry, and then you're able to go into the device section to go ahead and download the diagnostics that you might then plug into, Andrew's tool as an example, the community tool for the resource to pull out all the logs. Because again, while I saw that this failed in the scripts, I did not actually understand. It doesn't give you the telemetry to say why it failed or the errors or the error code. So still very limited in that regard. Might be reason you leverage this, but it'll help you troubleshoot down more narrowly than just, not having any telemetry coming back from the device to the portal as well too. So moving back into the comparison here, this is simply just, calling out the Gov Cloud support as a final note here. It's not supported in V1, it is supported in V2. But I think, given that it's only for EntreJoin, that might eliminate a lot of these other organizations that might want to be using that as an example. And then lastly, from the out-of-box experience for the end users, they'll actually have to go through the keyboard layout setup, the language selection in V2, up until the point that they get the login page. And then this is that separation of the two pages that I'm showing here. From there, this will actually crash if anything fails, and you will see that with the screenshot I'm showing on the screen here right now with this upside down ice cream cone. And they can either reset the device, or if you configure the settings, they may be able to blow through that. As an example, may just hard fail, and that their only option is to reset or export the logs, as you see here too. And then they only have one more screen before then they can, log into the device, as part of that experience as well too. So largely it is going to be a faster experience for the user in a lot of these cases, but it will also depend on the applications you're deploying. So is device preparation better than V1? It's probably the number one question I get asked, and I think it really depends. While there's certainly a lot of small limitations comparatively to V1 with V2, it can be faster, it can be simpler, but it also depends on the environment you're deploying it to. I actually haven't seen this deployed in a production environment from anybody that I've talked to, but if you are, let me know in the comments here and your experience. If you found this breakdown helpful, hit the like and subscribe button, and drop a comment also if you've already tried V2, and let me know any of the quirks or bugs that you guys are getting into. Thanks guys, I'll see you next week.